A closer look now at the political landscape in Britain as it heads into the formal Brexit talks. Professor Matthew Goodwin achieved some, well, notoriety in this election because of this tweet. "I do not believe that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn will poll 38%, he wrote. "I will happily eat my new Brexit book if they do." Well, Labour won 40% of the vote, nearly 10 points more than in the last election. And Professor Goodwin publicly ate his words on Sky News.
It's actually a hardback. There are lots of chemicals, but I've got to get through the whole thing. So.
OK. Well, we'll leave you to get through it, and hopefully some of your Twitter supporters are happy with you keeping your promise to the world of social media.
Matthew Goodwin is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Kent and a senior fellow at Chatham House. We reached him in London. You know, political pundits and observers have sort of had to say this several times if we've watched elections internationally recently, that we've got it wrong. How did observers, even like yourself, get it wrong in England this time?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? We've got more data than ever before, yet we are continually finding ourselves in this position where we're unable to explain the outcomes of big national elections. And in Britain this time around, we had a combination of problems, but perhaps the most important was that the opinion polls in general were underestimating support for the opposition Labour Party, which led them to give the incumbent Conservative Party a much bigger lead than they actually had in the real world. And that basic problem fed into all of our forecasts here in the UK, because every single forecaster who was producing a model on the election was using those polls. So, of course, almost every single forecaster was wrong as well, which meant all of the journalists were wrong as well, and also meant analysts like myself were wrong as well. So it wasn't a great election.
In the end, though, the Conservatives actually managed to increase their share of the popular vote. I gather Labour increased by more, but they still lost seats, obviously, and they've lost their majority. Where did they lose? With what kind of voters did the Conservatives lose?
I think this was an absolutely fascinating election, and I do see some parallels with Canadian politics. Not long ago, you had a populist challenger party called the Reform Party in mainly the west of Canada. And the Reform Party caused all kinds of problems for the Progressive Conservative Party until they actually reunited, and then they dominated Canadian politics for quite a long time. We had a similar situation ahead of this election where we had the populist outsider UK Independence Party, which wanted Brexit, really causing problems for the incumbent Conservative Party. And at this particular election, UKIP was expected to collapse, and those two parties were expected to come together like Reform and the Progressive Conservatives. Now, that did happen, and the Conservative Party did very well in pro-Brexit areas of the country, areas where there are lots of working-class voters, where typically average education levels are on the lower side, but where voters are really anxious over immigration and Brexit. The problem, however, was that at the same time, the Conservatives lost territory in areas of the country, more affluent, highly educated, socially mobile areas like here in London, but areas that also tended to vote to remain in the European Union. So the Conservative gamble that it could hold on to those Remain voters while reach out into Brexit areas of the country, many of which are in Labour hands, really didn't pay off. And Theresa May lost lots of territory in London and among 18 to 40-year-olds especially, but she failed to make enough gains in those Brexit territory to offset the losses. It's a fascinating election, but ultimately, of course, Theresa May is seen as the loser.
One headline on one of the pieces you wrote recently read, "The Revenge of the Young Urban Remainers." Talk about the impact of the younger vote in all of this.
Well, British politics right now is incredibly volatile, but it's changing very quickly too. And one of the reasons for that is because of this big polarization that we're seeing on age. And age now is becoming more important to explaining elections here in the UK than traditional things like social class or even things like income. So we're seeing the over 65s move behind the Conservative Party, which they see as being pro-Brexit, anti-immigration, traditional small c conservative. But the 18 to 45-year-olds, not only the millennials, but also the Generation Xers, they are really turning towards the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. So you have the baby boomers on one side, who, profited from final salary pensions. They've got perhaps 2 homes, one in France, one in London. They've done very well out of the post-war settlement. But you've got the younger generations, the millennials and the Generation Xers, who really feel left behind in their own right. They can't afford to buy a home, certainly not here in London, where the average deposit is about £100,000. They can't really afford to go to university because that costs now about £30,000, whereas for the baby boomers it was free. And they can't really afford to get on in life in general. So you've got this really big generational conflict that's brewing. And on top of that, of course, you put the Brexit vote, where the older Conservatives voted out and the younger millennials and the Generation Xers voted in because they saw their future as being within this economic bloc. And so that is really bubbling to a head now. And we're seeing it have a remarkable effect. If you just look at this election, where I work in Canterbury, Kent, which is in the southeast of the country, a very affluent seat, but also a student town, the Conservatives lost that seat to Labour for the first time since William Gladstone was in the building behind me in the 1800s. So we're seeing remarkable political change, mainly because of this big polarisation along age. And I think, this is what we're going to be talking about here in Britain for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
I just want to ask you briefly about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, because he's sort of, at least from this vantage point, you could look at him and say, well, perhaps he's a kind of Bernie Sanders kind of character. Is this the resurrection of Jeremy Corbyn, the politician everyone thought could never win?
Well, it's remarkable, isn't it? Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party lost this election, but they are being framed as the winners. They did better than expected, and they overturned many unwritten laws in British politics, but also global politics. Just remember where we were before this election. The Labour Party was a divided party. 170 MPs had said they wouldn't serve under Jeremy Corbyn, 170 Labour MPs. We were told that voters don't support divided parties. When we asked voters, who do you think's the most trusted party on the economy? They said the Conservatives. We were told that voters wouldn't back the economically incompetent party, or the party that was seen to be that way. And also, when you look at the local elections that took place only in May of this year, the Conservatives had an 8-point swing increase in their support, taking votes from Labour. So we know that until the campaign itself, the Conservatives were doing very, very well, winning lots of industrial working class areas. But then the campaign kicked in and Jeremy Corbyn kicked in. And Jeremy Corbyn suddenly reminded everybody how he'd got to be this prominent figure on the radical left of British politics, because he's quite good at getting on the grassroots trail and campaigning and drumming up support. He also offered a number of very clever policy moves. Free university education, essentially, no tuition fees for university graduates. He accepted the Brexit result. He said he'd honour it. He promised further investment in public services to really appeal to lots of voters who are anxious about the state of our health service. And he also, I think, brought an ordinary man on the street, quite populist sort of persona into the debate, and he talked about economic injustice and things that always go down very well in a country where lots of workers basically haven't had a pay rise for 10 years. So Corbyn really did connect with certain groups, but here's the trick. He's still a long way from winning a majority. He's going to have to win another 64 seats in England and Wales, assuming Labour makes no more progress in Scotland. They're going to have to win another 64 seats to win a majority. So put in other terms, they're going to have to get about a 7-8 point lead in the polls on the Conservatives if they're going to get back into power with a majority. So they've still got a lot of work to do.
I know things appear fairly uncertain still at this point, but if you were a gambling man and a bettor with your kind of background and experience, how much life do you think a Theresa May prime ministership has left in it?
Well, I am a gambling man. I gamble on politics regularly, which is legal here in the United Kingdom. And I would put a bet that Theresa May will not be the Prime Minister of this country in a year's time. I think Theresa May is going to be a very unpopular Prime Minister from here on. She's a greatly diminished political figure. You know, let's remember, she gambled everything on this result. The narrative was, strengthen my hand for the Brexit negotiations with the EU. Give me a mandate for my vision of Brexit. And in effect, the British people said no. And as a consequence, you know, her authority is greatly diminished. So I actually think where British politics is at the moment, we're basically where we were in 1974. You had a very fragile Labour government, you know, really couldn't command a majority in a secure position, and it limped on for 5 years. But let me tell you, during that 5 years, all of its authority, all of its power was drained away from the party. And of course, who followed? Margaret Thatcher in 1979. And when did Labour get back into power? 1997. So the big risk for the Conservatives here is there is a nightmare backdrop emerging in British politics. An economic stagnation. Inflation is rising, no one's getting a pay rise, the prices in the supermarkets are going up. The Brexit negotiations, maybe they don't go so well. Lingering public concern over security, terrorism, not to mention ongoing public anxieties over immigration and you know, the direction of British society more generally. All of this does not really point towards an easy term for the Conservative government. And of course now, unlike the last government, it is wholly dependent upon the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland to pass legislation in the House of Commons. That's the only way Theresa May has managed to get a working majority. And the DUP will bring their own sets of concerns to the table too. They want Brexit, but they are also very socially conservative. They don't generally support same-sex marriage. They don't generally support the right of women to choose an abortion, for example. They're very to the right. How are Conservative moderates going to handle that relationship over the next 5 years? How are the Conservatives going to win back those young millennials when they're in a government with a party that most millennials really don't like? You know, they view it as being ultra-right. So there are all kinds of difficult issues, all kinds of minefields that are emerging for the Conservative Party. So I really don't think Theresa May will be our Prime Minister for that much longer.
Thank you very much for your insight and your expertise on this.
Thank you.